Hey guys, it's me, Kari, and here we are continuing with Homecoming, Part 2, Chapter 7. A little sniffly today, so forgive me in advance if I sniffle. And I'm also out of breath. Okay. Late one morning, as Dicey stood in a blazing sunlight where the tent had been the night before, coiling up the long ropes so that Samson could stack them evenly on the truck and find them when he needed to stake down the sides of the tent that evening in Berlin, James and Maybeth and Sammy approached her. Hey, James said. I don't need any help, Dicey told him. Go on and do what you like. Are we going to go to Crisfield? James asked. We're all ready. We packed our things into our paper bag and your map, too. Will says he can take us now in Claire's car. Is it time? Dicey asked. Will says so, James said. Just let me finish this, okay? More goodbyes, Dicey thought to herself, coiling up the last rope into a dark brown hoop, piling loop upon loop. I am unfond of goodbyes, she said to herself. All of their goodbyes lay like the coiled ropes on the ground, connected and unconnected, curling silently. Finished things. But the kids were right and Will was right. It was time. Dicey took a deep breath. Time to get moving. She sat beside Will in the front seat. James and the little kids sat behind them. Dicey took out her map. Time to put the circus behind them. The circus people stood around and waved and made jokes. Dicey looked around at them, gathered together there in the fairground, their hands held high, their friendly wishes for good luck floating around the car still, like cherry blossoms blowing to the ground. The car pulled out of the fairgrounds. Goodbye, everybody called. Goodbye, goodbye. After a while, Dicey turned to the map. There was nothing to look at on the road. It was just like Route 1. What route are we on? She asked Will. 13. We follow that just south of a place called Princess Anne, then we get on to 313, Will said. How do you figure to find her? Look up the address in a phone book, Dicey answered. Then we'll ask directions. We've got lots of time, Will assured her. All I have to do is go back, pick up Claire and the beasts in the trailer, and make it to Berlin in time for supper. Are you going to take us right there? Dicey asked. He didn't turn his head. His profile was smooth lined, slightly curved except where his nose jutted out and his beard jutted out at the end of his chin. His skin was smooth and brown like silk. He didn't answer. He just nodded. But why? Dicey asked. To make sure you're okay, he said. Dicey looked out the window. City clutter had fallen behind, and now there was country clutter. Junkyards, a trailer park, billboards advertising dog food, and faraway hotels. Beyond these, the land stretched away to low, flat country. The fields and woods all had shallow ditches dug around them to drain away water. Most of the land was being used for farms, interspersed with patches of loblollies and other trees. Crisfield's a small town, Dicey said to Will. We'll be okay. You don't want me to take you right there, do you? Dicey leaned towards him. It's not that. She doesn't know about us. Not only that we're coming, but she doesn't even know we exist. We didn't know about her until our cousin in Bridgeport told us we had a grandmother, and I don't know how she'll be. There was this priest in Bridgeport. He had somebody here come to see her and tell her. She wouldn't let him in or listen. He said she screamed so she couldn't hear what he was saying, so I don't know how she'll act. Mama, her voice faded away. There's a lot you haven't told me, isn't there? Will asked. Yes, Dicey thought. It gets so complicated. I'll tell you what, Will said. How do you want to do it? I'll go along with you if you'll make me one promise. You keep your promises? Yes. If you'll promise me that you'll come to me if you need help. We'll be in Berlin for a week, 4 shows, and then 3 days off on the beaches. The police can always find me if you call. Will you promise? Dicey thought about that. But what could you do? Who knows? What friends do for each other? Something. Whatever. Will you promise? Okay, Dicey said. I promise. We'll be coming by again in 8 months, but anything can happen in 8 months. I can't just dump you kids off. Not and forget about you. I can't do that. But I can let you do it your own way if I know you'll call me if you need to, if it's not working out. Why? Dicey asked. I mean, why should you bother? You have your own life. You're a little bit of my life now. You can't get away, and I can't get rid of you. That's a fact. Dicey understood. A lot of people had little bits of her life now, and they were tied to her now, or she was tied to them. To some of them, she owed something that she hadn't paid yet, like Wendy and Stuart or Cousin Eunice. You didn't just let people go. That's what Will meant. You always did what you could. Dicey leaned back into her own corner by the door. Well, what I thought was, she said, we'd go downtown and find out where she lives, then just go out there. That was almost the truth. And you want me to leave you off and drive away? Will said. Dicey had no idea what he was thinking. Are you scared? He asked her. Some. Why? This is a last chance for us, Dicey said. I don't know about that, Will said slowly. You could say all of life is a series of last chances. Okay, Dicey said, but inside of houses, no matter what they look like from the outside, even that one, the car sped past a tall brick house surrounded by old elm trees and seeming serene and wise, as if it had stood there for so many years that nothing could surprise or hurt it. You can't tell what's inside. You can't tell what might happen. How do you know who to trust when you meet people? How can I tell about this, grandmother? I know I can always run, but when there are 4 of us... Wouldn't it be easier if I stuck with you? Will asked. Dicey shook her head. Well, yes, of course it would, but I have to know by myself, for us. Okay, Will said. Okay, you can have it your way. As they neared Crisfield, entered the town limits, followed the main street, they all fell silent. Dicey could almost hear the worries that nobody said aloud. The air inside the car grew thick with them. The road ran straight and broad until it came to the water. They looked around. Docks, most of them vacant now on this summer morning, stretched out into the bay. Sheds lined the land's edges. Piles of small wire boxes were everywhere, and oyster shells had been scattered like a layer of earth. A few people, mostly old men, sat in the sunlight, looking at nothing. Well, Dicey said, we'll meet again. Will turned to her, one way or another. Okay? Okay, Sammy said. The Tillermans climbed out of the car. Sorry, my throat is scratchy. And sniffles. They stood at the road's end by the water's edge. Will backed the car, turned it around, looked out the window to give them the thumbs-up signal, and drove away. Until the station wagon was out of sight, the Tillermans didn't move. Dicey held the grocery bag in one hand, and the other hand she held up in the farewell, until she could no longer see the square back of the car. They were on their own again. Okay, Dicey said. She passed the bag to James. You wait here, I'm going to find a phone book. She didn't wait for anything, not even to study the flat expanse of blue water. She walked back along the docks to the sidewalk and entered a grocery store. There was a poster in its windows advertising Will's Circus. The store was filled with darkness, dust, and the smell of the food on its shelves. Dicey stood inside the screen door for a minute while her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The only person in the store was a woman in a stained apron behind a glass-framed counter. Dicey walked up to her. The woman had thick, strong arms, and her hands were mottled red. Her face was pale and thick with flesh. Her eyebrows were straight and bushy over little colorless eyes. Yeah? She asked, leaning on her elbows on the top of the counter. What can I get you? Her words came thick and slow, like molasses. Again, something like Mama. I'm looking for a phone book, Dicey said. Do you have one I can look at? The woman nodded. She plodded out from behind the meat counter and walked heavily down to the cash register at the front of the store. She pulled out a thin phone book from underneath the counter there. She watched Dicey open it. There was a Peter Tillman on a place called Deal Island, and a G. Ridgely Tillerman in Princess Anne. There was no Abigail Tillerman. There was no A. Tillerman either. Maybe their grandmother didn't have a phone, or maybe it was listed under their grandfather's name. Only there was no Tillerman listed for Crisfield. Dicey looked at the pages and chewed on her lip. None of the Tillermans listed lived in Crisfield. Was her grandmother still here? Yes, because that priest had gone to see her. He would have told Father Joseph if she'd moved or died. He knew where she lived. Something wrong, the woman asked. I got work to do, the woman continued to prod Dicey. She leaned down on the counter as if she needed the rest. I was looking for the telephone number for Abigail Tillerman, Dicey said. Why would you do that? I was going to call her up to see if she needed some help around the place, Dicey said. I've never seen you before, the woman remarked. We're new, Dicey said. We just moved in. Ab won't hire you, the woman said. She's letting the farm go. Selling it, Dicey asked. No, she'd never sell that place, but she can't work it by herself. That's why I thought she might hire me, Dicey said. The woman shook her head, closed up the phone book, and put it away. Besides, she hasn't had a phone since Bullet died. If you'd asked me, I'd have told you. She came down and threw her phone through the telephone company window. You don't want to work for her. The woman trudged back down the aisle to the meat counter. Dicey stood where she was, listening to the hum of a large refrigerator. Where is her farm, anyway? She called to the back of the store. Down to the water, south, the woman answered. What road? Landing Neck. It goes off South Main, half a mile inland, maybe a mile. There's a bend on Landing Neck, and a new little house sits right on it. Next to mailbox is Ab's. But it's 7 miles. I wouldn't go out there. She's queer. Queer? Crazy as a coot. That's my opinion. We leave her alone. You should, too. Maybe you're right, Dicey said. No maybes about it. Dicey left the store. She returned to her family. Their eyes held the same question. Daisy sat on the edge of the dock, hanging her feet over the water. James, Maybeth, and Sammy sat in a line beside her. You couldn't see the bottom of the water. It was muddy, so you could only see a little way down into it. The waves gurgled underneath them. More bad news, Daisy thought to herself. But why didn't she feel bad? She looked around at the docks and the dozing men and the water and the shacks. She picked up an oyster shell and dropped it into the water. The air smelled of salt and fish and motor oil. You know what this is like? Daisy asked James. It's like Provincetown, isn't it? It smells like it. Yeah, what about our grandmother? She lives 7 miles out of town on Landing Neck Road. She doesn't even have a telephone. How do we get there? I don't know yet, but I thought, James, I want to go out there alone, just in case. I want you to stay here with the kids, and I'll come back for you when I know. Know what? If it's okay for us there. I don't like that, Dicey. What if you get in trouble? Better just me than all of us, right? Will said we could call the Berlin police to get him if we need help. So if I don't come back, then you can call him. Here's the money for lunch and anything. Can you keep an eye on Maybeth and Sammy? Yeah, but I don't like it. I'm in charge, James, remember? Okay, but Dicey gave him the money she had left, $9. She leaned over to Maybeth and Sammy. You do what James says, you hear? They both nodded. That's all right then, Dicey said. She stood up quickly and hurried away without looking back. The business section of Crisfield lay next to the water, low buildings with plate glass windows. The business section crowded as close as it could to the bay and looked out over the docks, as if that was where its real interest lay. Beyond that, residential streets branched out, circling around the town itself. There seemed to be 3 kinds of houses. There were lots of churches, even on the one street Dicey followed out of town. These were mostly small stucco or clapboard buildings with short steeples. Then there was the usual narrow clapboard houses on little handkerchief lawns, 2 stories high, 2 rooms wide. The third kind were large wooden houses with broad porches that ran around the buildings. They had odd shapes, round towers, octagonal bays, balconies. These houses had paint that had faded and peeled. Often their screens were ripped or their doors hung askew. But they spoke clearly of what they had once been. Once they had been homes for large, rich families. Once the spiraled pillars that held up the veranda roofs had gleamed with white paint. Once the tall windows of the ground floors had opened into rooms crammed with plush furniture and oriental rugs, and the large trees in the yards had swarmed with climbing children. These were the kind of houses that might have treasures in the attic or ghosts in the cellar. These were the kind of houses that could burst with life. Now they rotted quietly, neglected, sad, but filled with mysterious memories. Dicey walked on, walking fast. She turned at the second stop sign and found herself on Landing Neck Road, in farm country, where broad fields burgeoned with corn or barbed wire contained cows and horses, where chickens and ducks wandered around the yards. The farmhouses sat next to the road, quiet and clean, secretive. How would she know if their grandmother's house was safe for them? What questions did you ask a person to find out if you could like one another, if she could be trusted? Dicey's sneakers made no noise on the roadway. No cars overtook her. There was no sound at all except the occasional distant barking of a dog or lowing of a cow. The silence wrapped around her like a quilt, a silence made up of trees growing and corn ripening, of the bright sky glowing and the distant water following its tides. This was not an empty silence. 6 miles out of town, Dicey came to the expected bend in the road. A low 1-story white house looked out from a stand of pines. Behind it were stables. 2 pastures where long-legged horses grazed came next. Half a mile down the road, Dicey saw the mailbox, dented, rusted, its post awry. LLRMA was all that remained of sloppily painted black letters. The little door hung open like a dog's tongue. 2 or 3 old leaves lay inside, and a plastic glass with a straw sticking out of its cover. Across the road where the farm itself lay, overgrown fields stretched back to meet a thick woods of pine trees, oaks, and tall, top-heavy loblollies. The fields had small trees scattered over them, pine and maple saplings, and the grass was thick and tangled, as tall as Dicey's waist. The driveway ran straight between the fields. It was too overgrown. You could barely make out the ruts where car wheels would fit. The sun had risen high into the sky. Dicey turned into the driveway, walking slowly now, even reluctantly. She did not look ahead, but at the ground before her feet. Abandoned, that was the word this farm said to her. She couldn't even see the house until she had passed under the pines, walking now on a thick carpet of needles that seemed never to have been disturbed. The air under the pines was thick and shady. The house sat behind a small orchard, and beyond it, a barn was slowly falling down. The house was faded white clapboard, 2 stories high, and had a screened porch all along the front that ran around the sides. The roof, gray slate, slanted down in 4 directions from a central peak. 2 chimneys stuck up through the roof. The house was silent, vacant, neglected. Long weedy grass grew up as high as the porch floor. Honeysuckle spread over the screens of the porch, and its long fingers reached for the trees in the yard. Most of the trees were short, heavily leaved. Some had tiny apples growing on them. They had the rough bark of fruit trees. One larger tree grew right up in front of the house, hiding the front door, shading the lawn. This tree looked like an umbrella, held overhead by 4 trunks that spread out from their common source. Its broad leaves made a green canopy against the sunlight. It wouldn't be a good climbing tree, Daisy thought, walking up to it and past it, but you could make a platform treehouse to rest on the 4 trunks, and build steps out of pieces of wood to go up one trunk. Then you would have a house like a boat, almost floating on air, and the long leafy branches stretching above like sails. Daisy pushed her way through the long grasses to the steps leading to the porch. The grass tickled her knees. Grasshoppers leaped aside to let her pass. The steps were rotting away. The screen door hung from broken hinges. The sun couldn't penetrate the honeysuckle leaves, so the motionless air on the porch was as dark as twilight. Daisy knocked on the door. It was a wooden door, once painted white. A rusted nail stuck out from its center over Daisy's head. Nobody answered. She knocked again and listened. She heard faint noises, like some night creature scurrying, but the noises did not come towards the door. Somebody was in there, of that Daisy was sure. She knocked again, 3 loud raps. No voice called out. Daisy turned the knob and pushed against the door. It was locked. She went back across the porch and down the steps. She walked around to the side of the house. The side looked just like the front, except that it had no steps or door. There were 2 windows on the second floor and 4 on the first, which were barely visible through honeysuckle. The honeysuckle here had not grown as fast as that on the front of the house. The porch, she noticed, continued around the back. The whole house was surrounded by a broad porch. All the second-story windows had their shades down. Nobody could be seen inside, nor any light. Daisy went on around to the back. She saw the woman the moment the woman saw her. The woman sat on the bottom of some steps facing out, over more fields, only these had crops growing in them, and the distant dull green of marsh grass. She wore a shapeless blouse over a long shapeless skirt. Her feet were bare. Her dark eyes looked at Daisy angrily. Her skin was tanned. Her hair had been hacked short, so its iron gray curls burst helter-skelter all over her narrow head. Daisy stood where she was. She swallowed twice. Her throat was suddenly dry. "Mrs. Tillerman?" she finally asked. Her voice squeaked. "You're trespassing," the woman said. She had a thin, stiff voice, not like Mama's at all. "I thought I heard when I knocked. I didn't know if—" Daisy stepped forward. "The fact is, I wonder if you would hire me to work for you." She stood right in front of the woman now, her grandmother. Her grandmother's eyes seemed big for her face as she stared at Daisy, but maybe that was just because her face was small, the skin stretched tight over its bones. Her eyes, now that Daisy was closer, were not brown but dark hazel, browns and greens without any yellow to give them sparkle. Fine lines sprayed out from around her eyes. These were the eyes of the girl in Cousin Eunice's photograph album. The rest of her was all different, but the eyes were the same. "The fact is, you're trespassing," her grandmother said. "Who told you to come here?" "Nobody. I thought you were alone, so I'd try." "I don't know you, do I?" Daisy shook her head. "We're new here. Why aren't you in school?" "It's summer." "Not for long." Her grandmother stood up. She walked up the steps and through the screen door without looking back. The back door stood open and she went straight into a kitchen. Daisy followed her. Her grandmother opened a glass-fronted cupboard and pulled down a can of spaghetti. She took a can opener out of a drawer and opened the can. A saucepan waited on the stove. She opened another drawer, took out a big spoon, and scooped the stiff red and yellow contents of the can into the saucepan. With a match, she lit the fire under the burner. She dropped the match into an ashtray and turned to take a bowl out from the cupboard. Daisy might just as well have not been there. Her grandmother waited by the stove, stirring in the pan. "It didn't say come in," she said. "You never said if you wanted me to work," Daisy answered. Hazel eyes studied Daisy. Daisy studied the barefoot woman. Her feet were caked with earthy dirt. "How do I know you're not going to rob me?" her grandmother said. How could she know, Daisy thought. The people in the houses were in just as much danger as the people outside the houses. "I'm not," Daisy said. "Doesn't look like you have much to steal anyway." "You have family?" "Yes," Daisy said. "Where do you live?" "In town. I can work hard." Your barn needs painting, and it's the screens and the steps and the lawn. I could take off the honeysuckle. I'm not too old to do that. I can pick and weed. So can I. So can anybody. You better get down a bowl since you've invited yourself for lunch. Dicey did as she was told. They sat down at a long table, big enough for 10 people. It was made of wood and had been scrubbed to a pale, smooth finish. Dicey sat across from her grandmother. She spooned the canned spaghetti into her mouth. After the first bite, she ate quickly, trying to fill up her stomach without tasting anything. You like my spaghetti? Her grandmother asked. No, Dicey said, but I'm hungry. Do you like it? It's easy to fix. You know what I sometimes think? Her grandmother looked straight at her, her mouth chewing. I sometimes think people might be good to eat. Cows and chickens eat corn and grass and turn it into real good meat. People eat cows and chickens. In people, it might turn into something even better. Did you ever think of that? Dicey shook her head. Especially babies, her grandmother said. She swallowed thoughtfully. We're children. Do you have any brothers or sisters? Yes. Who told you I was alone? A lady in the grocery store. Millie. She's the butcher. Can you imagine that? A lady butcher? Why not? Dicey asked. I guess you might say so. Millie is one, and that's a fact. Facts are facts. What did she say about me? Nothing much. Did she tell you I was crazy? Her grandmother wasn't looking at her. Dicey didn't answer. Maybe I am, you know. When you die, all the gases build up in your body for weeks, like yeast and dough, and you swell and swell. Then things start exploding. That's where the stink comes from. After that, you're as fresh as a daisy, and the worms and the maggots have you. What do you think? Dicey put her spoon down. She was through eating. Her grandmother's mouth twisted. What do you think about death? Don't be smart with me, girl. Dicey was puzzled. Or don't you think? I saw a tombstone. Home is the hunter, home from the hill, and the sailor, home from the sea. That was what it said. As if, Dicey tried to explain her thoughts, that was the quiet place at the end of things. It's not quite, her grandmother said. Not for the worms. I wouldn't care about that if I was dead, Dicey said. Maybe I am crazy, her grandmother said. You know? Dicey was beginning to think she might be. Maybe not. Do you feel sorry for me? Why should I? Dicey asked. Old, alone, crazy, the farm falling down around me? My husband died these 4 years and more. I'm sorry, Dicey said. I'm not. I'm happy since he died. Why? Dicey asked. He kept wanting his shoes polished. He never did polish them himself. First thing I did, I bought myself a washing machine. Do you play the piano? No. Too bad, the woman said. I've got one. Haven't played it myself. I never had the time. My children did. They all died too, and that was a relief. Dicey stood up. She didn't even feel bad. She didn't feel anything, except maybe she was glad she came out here by herself. You're going? Her grandmother said. Dicey nodded. You didn't offer to help with the dishes. No, don't bother. I know what children are like. Okay, Dicey said. It didn't matter. She'd go back and get her family, and then they'd call Will. Don't you want to know if I want you to work for me? Her grandmother said. She was sitting in her chair, but she had turned around to watch Dicey leave. Well, I don't. I couldn't pay you anyway. Dicey nodded and turned her back to the room. The woman's voice spoke from behind her. I know who you are. You hear me? I know who you are, and you can't stay here. Bum, bum, bum. All right, guys, I will be back soon with Chapter 8. Please like this video if you did. Thumbs ups are always appreciated. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and please hit the bell icon to be notified of all my future uploads. Thanks again, and have a great day. Bye, guys.